the wife of death in Appalachia. The woman who felt her children rot inside her own womb. This is no legend. This is not folklore whispered around mountain fires. This is the documented horror of Martha Jean Collier, a name that still echoes through the forgotten hollows of eastern Kentucky. Where family trees do not branch, they circle back on themselves like serpents devouring their own tails. It was the year 1967. The place was Harlan County, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where a cold dust settled on everything like ash from a funeral pyre. Here, in a settlement so remote it appeared on few maps, lived the Collier family. For 7 generations, they had inhabited that same narrow valley, hemmed in by mountains that seemed designed by nature to keep the world out and to keep secrets in. Martha Jean was 19 years old when she married Thomas Ray Collier that spring. The ceremony was held in the family's weathered chapel, built by their great-great-grandfather in 1891. There were 43 people in attendance. Every single one of them was a Collier. The wedding photograph, now yellowed and cracked in the Harlan County Historical Society archives, shows a young woman with hollow cheeks and eyes that seem to stare past the camera into some unknowable distance. Beside her stands Thomas Ray, her husband and also her second cousin. His father and her mother shared the same grandparents, Benjamin and Ruth Collier, who themselves had been first cousins. Their settlement consisted of 11 structures scattered along a creek bed locals called Dead Run. The name came from a cholera outbreak in 1904 that killed 27 people in 3 weeks. But the families stayed. The Colliers always stayed. Dr. Robert Harrison, a physician who visited the hollow in 1965 as part of a rural health initiative, left notes that would later become crucial evidence. He wrote, "I have never witnessed such uniformity of features in a single population. Every child I examined had the same distinctive jaw structure, the same unusually set eyes, the same webbing between the second and third toes. When I inquired about family relationships, I was told simply that everyone was related to everyone, going back to the first settlers." Martha Jean grew up in a 2-room cabin with her parents, her 3 siblings, and her grandmother, who was also her father's aunt. The walls were papered with old newspapers from the 1940s. The floors were bare earth covered with planks. In winter, gaps between the boards exhaled a cold breath no fire could fully banish. Education in the hollow extended only to the 6th grade, taught by whoever in the family could read well enough to instruct the children. Martha Jean learned her letters from her cousin, a man named Ezekiel, who had made it as far as the 8th grade before the mines claimed him at age 14. By local standards, Thomas Ray was considered a good match. He worked steady in the mines, came home with his pay, and had all his teeth, which was rarer than it should have been among men his age in that place. That several of his siblings had not survived past childhood was not discussed. That his sister had been born without fully formed hands was attributed to God's will. The wedding night was spent in the cabin Thomas Ray had built himself, using timber from the same forest where his grandfather had cut wood for his own marriage home. The structure leaned slightly to the left, as if the earth itself was trying to shrug it off. Martha Jean became pregnant within the first month of marriage. In the hollow, this was celebrated as a blessing, a sign of fertility and family continuity. The women gathered around her, offering advice passed down through generations, remedies involving roots and herbs gathered from the hillsides, prayers spoken in the old way. But something was wrong from the beginning. By her 3rd month, Martha Jean began to feel movements inside her that didn't match what the other women described as sharp, irregular spasms, moments when her belly would harden like stone, then soften again, a persistent ache that radiated from her womb into her spine. The midwife, Clara Collier, who was also Martha Jean's great-aunt and Thomas Ray's grandmother's sister, examined her with hands gnarled from decades of bringing Collier babies into the world. She said nothing, but her face betrayed something Martha Jean had never seen there before: fear. In her 4th month, the smell began. At first, Martha Jean thought something had died beneath the cabin, perhaps a raccoon or possum. But the smell followed her everywhere. It emanated from her own body, a sweet, rotten odor that made her gag when she lay down at night. The other women in the hollow began to avoid her. They would cross to the other side of the path when they saw her coming. Children were pulled indoors when she walked past. Even Thomas Ray began sleeping on the floor, unable to bear the scent that clung to their bed. By the 5th month, Martha Jean could no longer pretend what was happening inside her was normal. The movements had stopped entirely. Where there should have been kicks and turns, there was only a heavy, dead weight pressing against her organs. The smell intensified until it permeated everything she owned: her clothes, her hair, her skin. She scrubbed herself raw with lye soap, but nothing helped. The rot was coming from inside, leaching out through her pores like poison seeking escape. Dr. Harrison, who had continued his sporadic visits to the hollow, was summoned by Thomas Ray's father in late September. The journey took him 4 hours by truck, the final mile on foot down a path barely wide enough for a man. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. In his personal diary, recovered after his death in 1989, Harrison wrote, "The smell hit me 50 feet from the cabin. I have attended battlefield injuries, gangrenous wounds, and decomposing bodies in my career, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered. The girl, and she was just a girl, lay on a straw mattress, her belly grotesquely distended. When I placed my stethoscope to her abdomen, there was no heartbeat, only silence. The fetus had been dead for at least 6 weeks, perhaps longer, and was decomposing inside her." Harrison begged Martha Jean to go with him to the hospital in Harland, 28 miles away. He explained that the dead tissue inside her was poisoning her blood, that she would die if the pregnancy was not terminated immediately. Martha Jean refused. The family refused. The hollow had its own ways, its own beliefs. To remove a child, even a dead one, was considered murder. To interfere with God's plan was unthinkable. And beneath these stated reasons lay something deeper, something darker that Harrison could sense, but not articulate: a fatalistic acceptance, as if they had seen this before, as if they expected it. Thomas Ray sat in the corner of the cabin, his face blank, saying nothing. His mother, who was also his father's niece, placed a hand on Martha Jean's forehead and recited prayers in a dialect Harrison couldn't quite place. A mountain tongue that seemed to predate modern English. The doctor left medication for infection and pain, knowing it was inadequate. He left his contact information, begging them to call if things worsened. He knew they wouldn't. The hollow had no telephone. The nearest phone was at the mining company office, 11 miles away. As Harrison walked back up the mountain trail that evening, he passed a small cemetery hidden among the trees. Most of the graves were marked with simple wooden crosses, names and dates carved roughly into the wood. Many were children. Many bore the surname Collier, and many, far too many, showed death dates within days or weeks of birth. One marker caught his attention. It read, "Baby girl Collier, born and died August 1952, sister-daughter of Maggie Collier." Sister-daughter. The hyphenated term made his skin crawl. He understood its meaning immediately. Back in the cabin, Martha Jean endured. The pain became her constant companion, radiating through her pelvis and lower back in waves that left her gasping. The fever came and went, spiking at night until she shook with chills despite the blankets piled upon her. The other women returned slowly, reluctantly. They brought broths and teas, though Martha Jean could keep little down. They sat with her in shifts, maintaining the vigil that mountain tradition demanded. They sang hymns in voices worn thin by hard living and harder losses. Clara, the midwife, examined her again in early October. Her expression remained unreadable, but she whispered something to Thomas Ray's mother that Martha Jean couldn't hear. Both women glanced at the door, at the woods beyond, at the family cemetery on the hillside. That night, Martha Jean felt things shift inside her. Not movement, but displacement, as if the dead weight in her womb was settling, collapsing in on itself. The pain that followed was unlike anything she had experienced. A tearing sensation deep in her core that made her scream until her voice gave out. Thomas Ray ran for Clara. By the time they returned, Martha Jean had lost consciousness, her body too exhausted to maintain awareness. Her pulse fluttered weakly at her throat. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made her look already dead. Clara prepared herbs she had sworn she would never use again. Remedies from the old country, from times before doctors, from knowledge passed down through women who had faced this same horror in centuries past. She brewed them in water from Dead Run Creek, water that tasted of iron and stone. When Martha Jean woke, Clara made her drink the bitter mixture. "This will bring it," the old woman said. "One way or another, this will bring it." The contractions began 36 hours after Clara administered the herbs. They were nothing like normal labor, according to the women who attended. They came in irregular clusters, violent spasms that arched Martha Jean's back off the mattress and left her too weak to even cry out. The smell became unbearable. Thomas Ray was sent outside. The other men retreated to the far side of the clearing. Only the women remained, faces covered with cloths soaked in vinegar, eyes streaming from the stench. For 2 days and nights, Martha Jean labored to expel what was already lost. The cabin became a chamber of suffering, lit by oil lamps that cast writhing shadows on the newspaper-covered walls. Outside, November rain fell in sheets, turning the yard to mud and the creek to a roaring torrent. On the third day, something emerged. Clara received it in cloths prepared for this purpose. No one spoke. The midwife's hands, which had delivered hundreds of babies over 40 years, trembled as she wrapped the tiny form. What came out was barely recognizable as human. The decomposition had progressed to such a degree that tissue had liquefied, bones had separated. But even in this state, certain features were apparent to Clara's experienced eyes, features that made her close her eyes and mouth a prayer to a God she was no longer certain was listening. The infant had been developing abnormally. The skull was misshapen, collapsed on one side. The spine was curved at an impossible angle. And there, where the tiny chest cavity had been, Clara could see what she had feared she would find: a malformed heart. Chambers fused together in a configuration incompatible with life. She had seen it before, twice in her long career, both times in Collier infants. Both times when the parents were too closely related, when the family tree had twisted back on itself one too many times. But Martha Jean's ordeal was not over. An hour after the first delivery, the contractions intensified again. The women looked at each other in confusion and dawning horror. Clara examined Martha Jean again, her face draining of color. "There's another," she whispered. "Twins." Martha Jean had been carrying twins, neither of which had survived past the 4th month. The second fetus was smaller, even more deteriorated. When it finally emerged, it was barely intact enough to identify as human. This one showed even more severe abnormalities. The head was grotesquely enlarged, filled with fluid where brain tissue should have developed. The limbs were shortened, twisted. Clara wrapped it quickly, not wanting the other women to see, not wanting Martha Jean to see when she regained consciousness. Outside, Thomas Ray sat on the porch steps, rain soaking through his clothes, smoking cigarettes rolled from tobacco his grandfather grew. He knew without being told that the children were gone. He knew, though no one had spoken it aloud, why they had died. He knew because his own mother had lost 3 babies the same way, because his grandmother had lost 5. Because the Collier family had been losing babies to the same curse for generations. They buried the twins at dawn in the family cemetery, in a single small coffin Thomas Ray had built during the night. No names were carved on the wooden cross, just a date, November 14, 1967, just a word, twins. 7 people attended the burial, all Colliers. No prayers were spoken. What prayers were left for children who never had a chance, whose fate was sealed by generations of choices made by people long dead, by isolation enforced by mountains and poverty and pride? Martha Jean did not attend. She remained in the cabin, hemorrhaging slowly, infection spreading through her body despite Clara's herbs and Dr. Harrison's antibiotics. The fever climbed higher each day. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling for her mother, sometimes for her babies, sometimes for death. In a lucid moment, she asked Clara a question the midwife had been dreading. "Why did they die?" Clara could have lied. She could have blamed God or bad luck or any number of comfortable falsehoods. But she was tired, so tired of the lies. Tired of watching this happen again and again. Tired of being complicit in suffering. "Because your husband is your cousin," Clara said quietly. "Because his father and your mother are too close in blood. Because we've been marrying each other for so long that our children are born broken." If you're watching this and thinking that someone should have stopped this cycle, that someone should have spoken up, that someone should have saved these children, leave a comment saying exactly that. Say it loud. Say, someone should have stopped this. Because you're right. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain on the tin roof. Martha Jean closed her eyes. A single tear traced down her hollow cheek. Deprar. Robert Harrison returned to the hollow 3 weeks after the twins were buried. He had been trying to secure permission to conduct a medical study of the community, to document what he suspected was happening. The state health department had been reluctant, citing privacy concerns and the difficulty of working with isolated populations. But Harrison was persistent. He had contacted colleagues at the University of Kentucky Medical School. He had reached out to geneticists. He had compiled death records from Harlan County, going back 70 years. What he found was staggering. Among the Collier family, infant mortality was 4 times the national average. Birth defects occurred at a rate 12 times higher than the general population. Stillbirths were so common they were barely recorded, and the pattern was consistent across multiple generations, intensifying with each successive cycle of intermarriage. When Harrison arrived at the Hollow in December 1967, he found Martha Jean barely clinging to life. The infection had spread to her kidneys. Her temperature hovered at 104. Her skin had a yellow tinge that signaled liver involvement. He made the decision without consulting the family. He carried Martha Jean to his truck himself, ignoring Thomas Ray's protests, ignoring the gathered clan members who tried to block his path. He drove her to Harlan County Hospital, where she would spend the next 6 weeks fighting for survival. The medical records from that hospitalization paint a grim picture. Martha Jean required 3 surgeries to remove necrotic tissue from her uterus. She received 14 units of blood. She was treated for sepsis, kidney failure, and liver damage. She survived, but at a cost. The surgeries left her unable to ever bear children again. At 19 years old, Her childbearing years ended in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and death. While Martha Jean recovered, Dr. Harrison conducted his study. He interviewed every adult in the hollow who would speak with him. He examined children, took blood samples, documented physical abnormalities. He drew family trees that looked more like tangled webs than organized lineages. The Collier family, he discovered, descended from 3 brothers and 2 sisters who had settled the hollow in 1847. For the first 2 generations, they had married outside the family, but as the years passed, as the roads worsened and the settlement became more isolated, the marriages turned inward. By 1900, every marriage in the hollow was between cousins of varying degrees. By 1930, the genetic pool had become so limited that everyone shared DNA at levels typically seen only between siblings or parents and children. By 1967, when Martha Jean married Thomas Ray, they were related through 6 different ancestral lines. The effects were everywhere Harrison looked: cleft palates, club feet, heart defects, intellectual disabilities, shortened lifespans. The community had normalized these conditions, accepted them as God's will or just bad luck. They had no framework to understand that they were the architects of their own genetic catastrophe. Harrison's study was never published in a major medical journal. The data was too sensitive, the ethical implications too complex. But it circulated among geneticists and public health officials, becoming an unofficial case study in the dangers of prolonged genetic isolation. Meanwhile, Martha Jean returned to the hollow in January 1968. She was 30 pounds lighter, scarred inside and out, fundamentally changed. Thomas Ray greeted her at the cabin door, awkward and uncertain. They lived together for 3 more months before she left him, walking out of the hollow with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small bag of belongings. She never returned. Dr. Harrison stayed in contact with her for the next 20 years. In their conversations, Martha Jean spoke about the isolation of the hollow, not just geographic, but psychological. How questioning the family ways was unthinkable. How the same surnames on every mailbox created a prison more secure than any walls. How poverty and pride combined to keep people trapped in patterns of harm. She spoke about the other women, the ones who had suffered similar losses and said nothing. She counted 11 women in just her mother's generation who had lost pregnancies the way she had. And she spoke about the moment in the hospital when a young nurse, not knowing Martha Jean's history, asked if she planned to have more children. Martha Jean had laughed, a sound without humor. "I can't," she said. "And even if I could, I wouldn't. Not there, not with him. I won't let my body be a graveyard again." The Collier family hollow exists today, though much reduced. Only 3 families still live there permanently. Elderly relatives who refused to leave when the mines closed in the 1980s. The census records it as uninhabited. The county considers it a ghost settlement. But if you know the old roads, you can still find it. Martha Jean Collier lived the rest of her life in Louisville, Kentucky. She worked as a cleaner in an office building, a job that asked nothing of her but her labor and gave her the anonymity she craved. She never married again, never had children. She died in 2003 at age 55 from ovarian cancer. The obituary listed no surviving relatives. No one from the hollow attended her funeral. But her story became a cornerstone case for understanding the consequences of sustained consanguinity. The cemetery on the hillside now holds more than 300 graves. Approximately 40% are children who died before their 5th birthday. The wooden crosses have weathered and fallen. Most names are now illegible, but county death records preserve a pattern of loss spanning 7 generations. Modern geneticists estimate that sustained first-cousin marriage increases the risk of recessive genetic disorders, by approximately 50%. When the pattern continues for multiple generations, when the genetic pool contracts, the risk multiplies exponentially. What was 50% becomes 70, then 90, then approaches certainty. The Collier family was not unique. Throughout Appalachia, in isolated hollows and remote settlements, similar patterns developed. Some were documented, most were not. The shame, combined with geographical isolation and cultural privacy, meant that countless families suffered alone, believing themselves cursed or sinful. In recent years, genetic testing and counseling have become more accessible. Public health initiatives have begun addressing the legacy of isolation. But for families like the Colliers, for women like Martha Jean, such help came too late, or not at all. The cabin where Martha Jean labored for 3 days still stands barely. The roof has collapsed on one side. The porch has rotted away. The newspaper on the walls has dissolved into pulp. But the small room where she suffered remains. Local hikers occasionally stumble across the settlement. They photograph the abandoned structures. They don't know the stories held within those walls. Martha Jean's story finally saw wider exposure in 1998 in a documentary about Appalachian health. The reaction was mixed. But Martha Jean herself, in one of her final interviews, had been clear. "I don't want pity," she said. "I want people to understand that what happened to me happens when families fold in on themselves. When isolation becomes a trap. My babies died because of choices made by people 100 years before I was born. I don't want any woman to ever feel what I felt." If you've watched until the end of this story, you understand why these histories must be told. These are the stories that mainstream history ignores. The human costs of isolation. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who truly cares about these hidden histories. If this story moved you, hit the like button. Share this video. Remember that behind every statistic about genetic disease, there are real people like Martha Jean who endured what no person should ever endure. The hollow still exists, silent among its mountains. The cemetery still holds its secrets. And somewhere in Louisville, in an unmarked grave, lies a woman who survived death growing inside her, who walked away from everything she knew, who refused to let her story die with her. This is the legacy of isolation. This is the cost of genetic folding. This is what happens when families become too closed and the world outside seems too far away. This is the story of the wife of death in Appalachia, the woman who felt her children rot inside her womb and who lived to tell the truth that no one wanted to hear.